I'm Dan Rockmore, Director of the William H. Newcomb Institute for Computational Science here at Dartmouth College. And on behalf of the college and the Newcomb Institute, I'd like to welcome you all to this year's Winter Donoho Colloquium, Playing History, the Digital Rebirth of Old Media, from Dr. Patrick Feaster of Indiana University. The Donoho Colloquium is an ongoing series of public lectures aimed at increasing awareness of the many important and sometimes surprising places in which computational ideas are shaping our lives. These events are made possible by a generous gift from David, Mickey, and Dan Donoho in honor of Dan's graduation as a member of the class of 2006. It's a central piece of the larger mission of the Newcomb Institute, whose aim is to support and to integrate computational thinking and computational ideas throughout the Dartmouth community. The Institute itself is made possible through the generosity of Bill Newcomb, Dartmouth class of '64 and former trustee of the college. As much as we think of computation and digitization as engines ever reshaping our future, computational ideas and technologies are also the foundation of some of our greatest efforts for understanding and preserving our past. Computation-intensive processes enable digital reconstructions of ancient cities and tombs. Advanced statistical algorithms make possible reconstructions of patterns of evolution and speciation from genetic and fossil data. Even our understandings of the beginnings of time and space are not beyond the scope of modern computing. Echoes of the Big Bang still resonate around us, collected amid a cacophony of stellar noise and extracted and then preserved by complex signal processing techniques. This afternoon's speaker is also in the business of bringing back to life some of our earliest echoes, but those of human origins. By using a deep understanding of early recording processes, Dr. Feaster and his colleagues are able to play back visual records of sound recordings that heretofore have only been available to us as things to look at. I first came upon Dr. Feaster's work at the Contemporary Art Museum site Santa Fe, where I listened to his playbacks of the visual records produced by the first recordings of human heartbeat and pulse. Patrick Feaster is a specialist in the history, culture, and preservation of early time-based media. Interestingly, Dr. Feaster comes to this work from a non-engineering background. He studied history and German as an undergraduate and received his doctorate in folklore and ethnomusicology in 2007 from Indiana University, whereupon which he became aware that the level of attention paid to early film, that is the early machine-produced visual recordings, was not matched for early recorded sound. This soon became his passion, and he is now media preservation specialist for the Media Digitization and Preservation Initiative at Indiana. Dr. Feaster is also the current president of the Association for Recorded Sound Collections, as well as the co-founder of the First Sounds Initiative, whose mission is to, quote, make humanity's earliest sound recordings available to all people for all time, end quote. His book, Pictures of Sound, 1,000 Years of Educed Audio, 980 to 1980, won the 2013 Association for Recorded Sounds Collection Award for Excellence in the Best General Research in Recorded Sound, Best History category, and was also nominated for a 2014 Grammy for Best Historical Album. He's a 3-time Grammy nominee. Patrick's work shines a bright light on the power of outstanding historical preservation. It's not just about possessing things from the past, but being able to use them anew so as to re-inhabit past worlds with current awareness. In a Valley News article this past weekend, Patrick Feaster says that in listening to these old recordings, quote, it really is about the closest thing you can experience to time travel, end quote. So sit back, prepare for a ride back to the past, made possible by computational ideas from the present. Please join me in welcoming our 2016 Winter Donoho Colloquium lecturer, Dr. Patrick Feaster.
Thanks, Dan. I'd like to kick things off with a little story about audio archaeology. A few years ago, Jerry Fabris, curator of sound recordings at Thomas Edison National Historical Park, told me about an intriguing box of phonograph cylinders he had just digitized there. You know, phonograph cylinders, things like this. Now, he wasn't sure what he was hearing from the individual cylinders, which were unlabeled, except that many of them seemed to be in German. or to have German announcements. Jerry invited me to try to figure out what they were, and when I listened to the transfers he'd made, I quickly recognized that we were dealing with recordings from an important trip taken by Theo Wangemann, one of Edison's associates, who took a phonograph to Europe in 1889 and made recordings of the artistic and political luminaries of the day, all of which had until then been presumed lost. After I'd taken a stab at identifying some of them, I turned for help to my German colleague Stefan Puy, who did the lion's share of identification and transcription. He's the one who identified a record of the voice of Otto von Bismarck. But here's one I figured out on my own. In October of 1889, Wangemann had paid a visit to the estate of Count Helmut von Moltke, the main military strategist in the 19th century wars of German unification, and his voice, too, was represented in the group. Here's some of what he had to say.
Also am Filene am 21. Oktober
'The phonograph makes it possible for a man who has already rested long in the grave once again to raise his voice and greet the present.' Interesting sentiments, and people today often do write about the playback of these very old recordings in terms of bringing people back to life or resurrecting them as though we were engaged in something akin to necromancy. Notice that Moltke misidentified the invention the first time around, calling it a telephone, and so had to say it over again. But that's not the only remarkable thing about this bit of audio. Previously, the person with the earliest birth date from whom we had a recording was the Hungarian revolutionary leader Lajos Kossuth, who had been born in 1802. But Helmut von Moltke was born in 1800, technically the last year of the 18th century. So here, for the first time, we had a single voice spanning four centuries. Imagine the crying of a baby in the 18th century, the mature voice of a distinguished statesman in the 19th, the silent potential of a recorded voice throughout the 20th, and a resonification through modern technology in the 21st. And there's a wonderful irony here. Moltke's nickname was Der große Schweiger, the great silent one, because he had a reputation for speaking very little, and yet of all the hundreds of millions of people born in the 18th century, his is the only voice we can hear today. The phenomenon of hearing recorded sounds played back was now so ubiquitous that we generally take it for granted. Even hearing sounds recorded quite some time ago, say back in the 1920s, isn't sufficiently out of the ordinary to give us much pause for thought. But every now and then, we get an opportunity to listen back significantly further into time than usual, to hear voices from generations that were already on the brink of vanishing when a technology first emerged that could preserve them, sounds that straddle the boundary that separates the past we can still hear recorded traces of from everything in human history that had gone before. And suddenly, our ability to play back recorded sounds becomes startling and magical again. I say again, because to people in the 1870s who first experienced phonographic playback, it had counted as a feat of mind-blowing, cutting-edge virtual reality, much like reproducing the sight of a horse at full gallop by displaying a sequence of rapidly taken photographs of it at the rate at which they'd been taken, a breakthrough that came at roughly the same time. The first person in the world to record and play back sound was Thomas Edison. In the version of his speaking phonograph first unveiled to the public in 1877 and 1878, sound waves made a membrane vibrate, causing a stylus attached to it to move up and down and indent a sheet of tinfoil into a groove on a rotating cylinder. And when a stylus attached to another membrane was then run back over those indentations, it produced a sound more or less recognizably like the one that had been recorded. You might assume this would be the starting point for our heritage of recorded sound, that there's no way we could hear any audio predating this. Moreover, indented tinfoil wasn't a very suitable medium for long-term preservation. It wasn't until the wax cylinder superseded it in the 1880s that voices such as Moltke's started being captured phonographically for posterity in earnest. But what Edison had really pioneered was not the recording of sound, but the playback of sound. The first person to record sound vibrations out of the air over time was Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville, a Parisian typographer. He'd come up with the idea all the way back in the year 1852, while at work proofreading a treatise on physiology. The treatise contained a description of the mechanical working of the human ear, claiming that the eardrum vibrates at the same rates as objects that produce airborne sounds, bells, strings, and so on. And this inspired Scott to imagine creating an artificial ear that would pick sounds up out of the air in the same way a real ear does, but instead of passing the signal along to the brain, it would automatically record the vibrations by tracing them onto a moving surface. Sometime in late 1853 or early 1854, he and some friends tried this idea out for the first time, tracing the sounds of speech and guitar on soot-blackened plates of glass using a handheld paper membrane and then making the photographic prints of them that you see here. At the beginning of 1857, Scott formally patented an instrument called the phonautograph, or sound self-writer. He wasn't completely sure which of the mechanical parts of the ear he needed to simulate, so he was pretty thorough in his patent, providing a funnel corresponding to the outer ear, one membrane corresponding to the eardrum, and another membrane corresponding to the oval window, with a variety of complicated adjustable parts in between. Later, Scott sometimes also threw in a chain of artificial ossicles, or tiny bones of the middle ear, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. You can see a sketch of that arrangement in the background of this image. But in practice, his phonautograph usually took a simpler form. Sounds were concentrated into a funnel, a membrane at the opposite end of the funnel vibrated in response to them, causing a stylus attached to the membrane to move back and forth as it traced a line onto a sheet of soot-blackened paper wrapped around a rotating drum. Scott's inscriptions, or phonautograms, represent sound waves according to the same logic as the waveform displays in sound editing software and the grooves on LPs do. These are all fundamentally graphs of the amplitude of sound waves as a function of time. However, Scott's goal wasn't to play back the sounds he recorded as sound, but to capture them visually, much as a seismograph records earthquakes, but isn't generally used to recreate earthquakes as earthquakes. In fact, if you could do that, I think they'd be a lot more strictly controlled than they are. Scott believed he could capture subtleties of the living voice on paper that were missing from conventional writing and musical notation, the same subtleties in principle that can still make a sound recording more valuable than a script or score today. He prepared a number of hybrid texts like the one you see here, combining conventional alphabetic writing with the graphical features of sound waves. Louder sounds are taller, softer sounds are shorter. Faster sounds are bunched together, slower ones more drawn out along the x-axis, and so forth. Scott's hope was that people would learn to read phonautographic texts by eye, and that when they did so, they'd be able to hear the performances they embodied imaginatively in their mind's ears. Scott lived just long enough to witness the unveiling of Edison's phonograph in 1877 and 1878, which finally brought playback into the picture. He was unimpressed, and he even self-published a book, bitterly arguing that Edison had missed the point. The real goal, he urged, ought to be finding a way to write down sound so that it could be read and deciphered visually, something for which Edison's indented sheets of tinfoil didn't seem very suitable. In the end, nobody ever learned to read phonautograms as Scott had originally hoped. Even today, nobody can simply look at a waveform and decipher spoken words from it. But for many years past, the fact that phonautograms should theoretically be playable as sound was no great secret. There were just two problems. One was that in the pre-digital world, converting inscriptions on paper into playable form would have required some kind of analog physical transformation, such as photo engraving. The other, probably more important, was that the well-known examples from the 1870s and before were all very short, like the ones you see here. Even if we were somehow to play these traces back, each one would last for only a split second, scarcely long enough to be recognizable as anything. For many years, this was all anybody had reason to hope for from the pre-Edisonian world of recorded sound. That's where the First Sounds Initiative comes in. Here you see the co-founders. That's Richard Martin and Megan Hennessy of Archaeophone Records on the left, David Giovannoni in the middle, and me on the right. In 2007, the four of us had just finished work on a CD called Actionable Offenses, Indecent Phonograph Recordings from the 1890s, a compilation of, let's be frank, the oldest known surviving smut recordings, which had to be strategically bleeped when they were played on NPR. We'd enjoyed working on that CD together and wanted to find some other worthy project to take on. And one idea that came up was to track down the world's oldest surviving sound recordings and try to make them talk and sing. So we asked ourselves, well, what are they and where are they? As I mentioned earlier, all the well-known examples of phonautograms at that point were extremely short, split-second affairs, scarcely worth trying to play. But I had a lead. At some Xerox copies I got my hands on of patent papers Scott had filed in France in 1859 appeared to show a really long phonautogram, apparently submitted as an example of what the phonautograph could do. The copy I had was so poor it was hard to make out just what it was, but in December 2008, David Giovannoni visited the patent office in Paris, requested the original document, made a high-resolution scan. Turned out to be a record of the sound of a tuning fork, kind of disappointing in terms of content, unfortunately. But in the meantime, we'd continued scouring the documentary record for references to other places where Scott had deposited phonautograms, and in March 2008, we hit pay dirt at the Academy of Sciences in Paris. Several nice, long phonautograms labeled as records not of mere tuning forks, but of singing and dramatic recitations. We've continued the hunt since then, and as of now, we've located and digitally preserved a total of 50 surviving Scott phonautograms. But as of March 2008, a phonautogram of Au clair de la lune, dated April 9th, 1860, looked to be the most promising of the lot, and we immediately set to work to play it back. David did the image processing. Our partners at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory carried out the raw conversion of the individual rotations into audio, and then David stitched the pieces together. But we weren't quite done yet. The problem is that Scott had rotated the cylinder of his phonautograph by hand, and its speed was irregular enough to distort a sung melody beyond recognition. Fortunately, Scott had recorded the vibrations of a tuning fork as a time reference alongside the trace of the voice, and he documented the frequency of the tuning fork, quote, 500 simple vibrations per second. That gave us a steady pilot tone we could use to correct for the speed fluctuations in the trace of the voice. So, when David emailed me the uncorrected results stitched together as a stereo file with the voice in one track and the tuning fork in the other, here's what it sounded like straight off the paper. So I took this file and stayed up into the wee hours of the morning on March 15th, 2008, adjusting the tuning fork to 500 hertz, 5 cycles at a time by hand, and the voice track along with it. Somewhere around sunrise, I finally got to hear somebody recognizably singing Au clair de la lune in Paris in the year 1860, shortly before the outbreak of the American Civil War. We drew two conclusions from this. First, the singer sounded like a young girl, we speculated she might be the inventor's daughter. Second, it was apparent that Scott had recorded sounds successfully enough in 1860 for us to be able to recognize a song from its playback. Nobody had known that until then. Nobody had any way of finding that out. So we prepared a press release announcing the world's oldest sound recordings played back for the first time, and we had played back one of Scott's phonograms just as objectively as if we dropped a needle onto a record on a turntable. The results might not have been quite faithful enough to the original sounds for them to count as a fully successful reproduction of them, but in fact, sound recording equipment never creates a truly holistic copy of sounds. It always represents them subjectively, for instance, by reducing three-dimensional complexes of vibrations to their two-dimensional impact on one or more given points in space. So, I prefer to talk about phonographs and other such instruments not as reproducing sound, but as educing it, which means, in the words of the Oxford English Dictionary, to bring it out, elicit it, develop it from a condition of latent, rudimentary, or merely potential existence. I want educing a phonogram to be like projecting a film. It doesn't imply anything one way or the other about the reproduction of an originating sound, but only about the actualization of a media object, and that we had definitely done. So, for us, it was world's oldest sound recordings played back for the first time, but it was interesting to see how the media in different places chose to spin the news. The New York Times headline was, "Researchers play tune recorded before Edison." In France, it was, 20 years before Edison, a Frenchman invented sound recording. In Germany, it was, sounds like a strangled chicken. And radio reportage had quirks of its own. Here's what the BBC had to say.
American historians have discovered what they think is the earliest recording of the human voice, made on a device which scratched sound waves onto paper blackened by smoke. It was made in 1860, 17 years before Thomas Edison first demonstrated the gramophone, and featured an excerpt from a French song, Au clair de la lune. The award-winning screenwriter Abbie Mann has died at the age of 80. He won an Academy Award in 1961 for Judgment at Nuremberg. Abbie Mann also won several Emmys, including one in 1973 for a film which featured a police detective called... the character on whom a long-running TV series was eventually based.
It's 10 minutes past 8. Fighting between sheer militias.
There we go. Okay. So it's called corpsing in the trade. Apparently someone had whispered to her, sounds like bees buzzing in a bottle, and she just lost it. But if we turn to YouTube, we find that the BBC announcer wasn't the only one who caught the giggles from our work. And others responded a little differently.
Now listen to the audio. This is so spooky. It's the song Au clair de la lune. They just got the second verse of it, but you gotta listen to this. It is so spooky.
In short, our playback of Scott's phonogram seems to have affected some people, at least, on a visceral, emotional level, whether provoking them to laughter or giving them goosebumps, and those may be perfectly appropriate responses to the experience of hearing back further in time than anyone had ever heard before. But there's more than one way to convert a wavy line into digital samples in a playable sound file. For our initial release in 2008, we relied on software developed by our friends at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory as part of an optical playback system for analog gramophone records called IRENE, I-R-E-N-E. That's an acronym, they say, for Image, Reconstruct, Erase Noise, etc. But they actually gave it that name because the first audio they retrieved using it was a recording of Goodnight Irene by the Weavers. Their software uses algorithms to try to identify the position of a groove, or in our case, a line, two-dimensional line, at each successive point along the time axis, as though it were being followed by a stylus on a turntable. They call it a virtual stylus. Au Clair de la Lune had presented us with some pretty straightforward waveforms that fit this logic, which is why they were able to convert them into audio for us so quickly and so straightforwardly. But many of the remaining phonautograms we'd found look more like this, traces with broad smudges and points where the trace loops backwards relative to the direction of recording. These examples violate the basic assumptions of the virtual stylus approach. Imagine trying to play grooves shaped like this on a turntable with a stylus, and you'll understand why. You can't identify where the trace is at a given point along the time axis if it's actually in multiple places at once. So how are we going to make these phonautograms talk and sing, or was it just hopeless? Well, I ended up finding a solution using Andrew Yaremko's Image to Sound, a piece of freeware designed to convert bitmap images into sound as though they're optical film soundtracks. Now, optical soundtracks on motion picture film consist of long, narrow bands that vary either in width or in opacity. So when they're moved past a light source, they obstruct it to varying degrees so that the fluctuating intensity of light can be transduced into an audio signal. Back in the 1920s, experimental artists sometimes painted optical film soundtracks by hand as a means of generating novel synthetic sounds. And Image to Sound was really designed to let people do the same thing in the digital realm. Basically, it calculates the average brightness of successive columns of pixels in a digital image and assigns the values to successive samples in a digital sound file. Scott's phonautograms might not seem to fit this model at first glance, but I realized that by filling in the space above and or below the trace with white, we could convert his phonautograms easily into bright bands of varying width, which this software could then convert into playable audio. Unlike our earlier approach, this method can accommodate highly distorted traces without violating its basic logic. After all, I don't need to match each point in time to a single trace position. I just need to fill the area above and or below the trace and then measure how wide it is. Granted, this approach doesn't correct distortions, but it doesn't get thrown off by them either. Loopbacks and other problems essentially get averaged out, smoothed over, letting us extract something audible out of traces that would otherwise be beyond hope. One of the first phonautograms I applied this approach to was labeled as a recitation of the opening lines of Torquato Tasso's pastoral drama Aminta, a record of speech this time, rather than singing as before. Scott had written out the text itself at the bottom of the sheet. In translation from Italian it runs, "Who would believe that under human form and under this pastoral garb would be found a god, not only..." And then it cuts off. He also added an important footnote. "I was wrong," he writes. "It should be umane forme." The order of two of the words in the passage was messed up. The official text of the play has umane forme, but Scott had initially written forme umane. Scott takes responsibility for the mistake. So the question was this: had he simply written it down wrong, or was he taking responsibility for having recited it incorrectly? In which case we'd know this was a recording of Scott's own voice. To find out whether the phonogram itself featured the phrase umane forme or forme umana, of course, we had to play it back and hope we could tell from listening, but it was one of the badly distorted examples, which is why it had to await this second technique that I just described to you. So once I'd figured out how to do that, I converted the waveform into audio and then used the tuning fork trace to correct the speed. Here's what I heard when I played this phonogram at the same speed we'd used for Au Clair de la Lune. Sounds like perfectly natural human speech, doesn't it? No, sounds unmistakably like a recording of speech being played at twice the correct speed. Here it is again at half that speed. Well, the speaker says forme umane. Don't know if you were able to make it out, but he does. Listened to it many times. So he confirmed that it was Scott himself talking to us across the ages. But We also discovered that we'd been playing other phonautograms, such as Au clair de la lune, back at twice the speed we should have. Problem was this: we'd been unsure what Scott meant when he wrote he'd used a tuning fork vibrating at 500 simple vibrations per second. Did he mean 500 of these, or 125 hertz, as his own notes imply? Did he mean 500 of these, or 250 hertz, as acousticians of the day would have understood? Or did he mean 500 of these, 500 hertz, the unit that seems most obvious to us today? Now, when we'd initially listened to Au clair de la lune at each of these speeds, 500 hertz had been the only one that even seemed close to being right to us. And it sounded convincingly like the voice of a young girl, but we've since confirmed beyond reasonable doubt that 500 simple vibrations per second meant 250 hertz. So, where we'd thought we'd faithfully reproduced the singing of a young girl echoing through a mist, it turned out we'd created a 19th century version of the Chipmunks. Okay, enough of that. We've since slowed Au clair de la lune to its correct speed, and I've also reprocessed it into audio from the original scanned images using my optical film soundtrack technique. Here you see a piece of the phonotogram of Au clair de la lune. Our original results from 2008 with the virtual stylus approach are shown at the bottom, and the results I got using my own method in 2011 are shown at the top. As you can probably see, my version successfully follows the trace at points where the virtual stylus algorithm got confused by distracting visual noise, but I should emphasize it's not that my method is better, I just did more of the work by hand. So here's Au clair de la lune as we now believe it should be. This remains today the oldest recording of the human voice we can play back confidently at a consistent speed, even if we'd been wrong at first about what that speed was, and you can hear why. And since we know Scott recited the excerpt from a Minto, we now assume he sang and recited all his known experimental recordings, including this one. But it turns out that he'd sung Au clair de la lune very slowly and deliberately, even painfully so. I'm told this is the pace at which the song is traditionally sung as a lullaby, so we may have to give up our romantic notions about Scott having made a record of his daughter's voice, but as a consolation, we might at least have a record of the way he sang her to sleep. That said, the real reason for the lugubriousness is probably a practical one. Scott was experimenting to see whether different pitches would leave clearly distinguishable traces. Singing relatively slowly gave relatively long traces that were relatively easy to study. So by playing back the phonotogram as sound, we gain insight into Scott's strategy for performing Au clair de la lune in a way that was optimized for making a visibly intelligible record. Meanwhile, by listening to other phonotograms, we discover that Scott occasionally recorded lively performances of singing as well, consistent with his goal of capturing the expressive subtleties of human performance. Here's his latest known phonotogram, recorded probably in late September 1860, featuring The Song of the Bee from Queen Topaz, a comic opera by Victor Massé, first performed just a few years earlier in 1856. Scott's spoken word phonotograms are similarly varied in approach. Here's an example in which he's written in the syllables above the traces corresponding to them, suggesting that he's trying to determine whether he can decipher speech sounds visually. And when we listen, Scott's delivery is just as monotonous as we'd expect from that goal. Le jour, you get the idea. But at other times, Scott seems to have been less interested in words than in the intonations of dramatic elocution. His favorite passage for demonstration purposes along these lines was an excerpt from a French adaptation of Othello that ran like this. So, to this faithless rival, Edelmoen must have given this diadem. In their cruel rage, our lions of the desert beneath their burning lair sometimes tear apart the trembling traveler. It would be better for him, for their devouring hunger, to scatter the scraps of his palpitating flesh than to fall alive into my terrible hands. It seems to have been Scott's equivalent of Edison's Mary Had a Little Lamb. And what you see on the screen is a hybrid inscription of the Othello passage, which Scott had drawn by hand, but here's an actual phonogram of the same passage made on April 17th, 1860, and although you probably can't make out the words, you can definitely hear that Scott's hamming it up almost as much as I just did. Of course, by making these documents audible, we're subverting Scott's own intentions. He didn't believe playback should be the goal. And the title of an essay by Jonathan Stern and Mitchell Akiyama refers to the Au clair de la lune phonogram appropriately enough as the recording that never wanted to be heard. But it would be hard to distinguish expressive performances from tests of sheer intelligibility just by looking at the waveforms. We learn important things about the scope of Scott's efforts by listening to them, quite apart from the affective experience we gain by doing this. Now, even earlier examples do survive of Scott phonograms, but unfortunately they don't have the tuning fork trace as a time reference. There's no way reliably to correct for the irregular rotational speed of the cylinder, so for the moment at least, we end up with audio from them that sounds like this. That was played back from the paper at a consistent linear speed of 18.375 inches per second, the result of combining a standard CD sampling rate with a scanning resolution of 2400 dots per inch. The speed fluctuations garble the content beyond recognition. But does it still count as a sound recording? After all, nobody would argue that this isn't a sound recording, as messed up as it is, in essentially the same way. What's the world's oldest recording of the human voice? Well, it depends on what standards you want to hold it to. Moreover, I'm optimistic that we'll eventually be able to correct for the speed fluctuations in these earlier phonograms, or at least some of them, at least in part. If we study the tuning fork traces in the later phonograms, we can see that there was some regularity to the speed changes, as you'd expect from manual cranking. If we can pinpoint similar patterns in the earlier phonograms, we should be able to compensate for them. So stay tuned. The results we'd achieved with phonograms were so gratifying that I started looking for other primeval sound recordings on paper that I could try to make talk and sing, and here's another one that seems particularly to have captured people's imaginations. An ink print of a gramophone record published in a German magazine back in 1890 to show curious people what these newfangled disc records looked like before any of them had yet been put on the market. Note that this is the format that later evolved into the vintage vinyl we all know and love. So let's go through all the steps involved in playing this picture of a record. We start with a high-resolution flatbed scan of the source image at 2400 dpi, invert it into a bright trace on a dark background, convert it from a spiral into a set of straight lines, polar to rectangular coordinates in Photoshop, cut out the individual traces one by one into narrow strips and join them end to end. That's step one in this chart. For step two, erase any extraneous marks surrounding the trace and join any breaks in it. For steps 3 and 4, fill the top and bottom of the image, respectively. Then in step 5, run those images through image to sound, with the top-filled image feeding into the left channel of a stereo file, the bottom-filled image feeding into the right channel. In step 6, sum the two channels to mono, result, a playable wave file corresponding to the waveform in the source image. This particular example is a recording of Emil Berliner, inventor of the gramophone, reciting a German poem, Der Handschuh, or The Mitten. It goes on from there. This recording is exciting mainly because it's the oldest gramophone recording currently available for listening, the earliest direct audible ancestor of the vinyl LP. But the content wasn't much of a surprise. The accompanying article had already stated what it was. Here's a print found in one of Emil Berliner's scrapbooks at the Library of Congress that was more of a mystery. Other than the date, 1889, I had no idea what the content was going to be when I set about playing it back. Turned out to be pretty interesting, among other things. It's Berliner speaking again. He gives the exact date, November 11th, 1889, and discusses some of his lesser-known gramophone experiments. We learned things about his work from this, and we were successful in deciphering all this from the playback. That part's in German, like Der Handschuh, but here's another excerpt from it, which I think you'll be able to appreciate without a translation.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. That's all my opinion. Morgen rot, jag tekniker som triumfar. Att jag fick framför gladen, som möttes för ögonhjärtan, i den
That last part, Reuters Morgenlied, was the oldest known surviving recording of singing in the German language. So this is all pretty old, but can we go back even further in time than this? Well, Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville was the first person to record sound vibrations out of the air, but previous researchers had made similar records by attaching styli directly to vibrating bodies, including this tuning fork trace published in 1850. Yeah, okay. Not so exciting, but it's roughly analogous to a recording made directly from an electric guitar pickup, even though the sound didn't pass through the air. And then there are these waveforms printed in 1806 to illustrate the concept of beats, drawn rather than automatically recorded. Now, there's no past reality to play back in this case, but we can still educe this, just as we can educe sounds from signals produced by electronic synthesizers. Now, what you heard was derived directly from this print, and it's also consistent with the inscription's intended meaning as a representation of sound, which is why I feel pretty justified in thinking of this as legitimate audio content from the year 1806. Now, I don't know of any earlier drawings of acoustic waveforms than this one, but the waveform is only one way of displaying acoustic data as a graph of time versus amplitude. Another option is the sound spectrogram, a graph of time versus frequency. These two forms of display are largely interchangeable to the point that many pieces of audio software will let you toggle back and forth between them. Now, automatically produced sound spectrograms date back to the 1940s and finally made it possible for people to do what Scott had once hoped they could do with phoneticgrams, decipher recorded words visually by learning to recognize the patterns produced by different speech sounds. But sound spectrograms can be educed as audio too. I've been using a program called Audio Paint by Nicholas Fournel for this purpose. It uses additive synthesis, combining together sine waves at frequencies corresponding to the height of pixels and amplitudes based on their brightness. So here's a sound spectrogram published in 1947, supposedly of the phrase, "She was waiting on my lawn." Let's listen.
She was waiting at my lawn.
A little uncanny sounding maybe, but clear enough that we can tell the caption's wrong. She actually says she was waiting at my lawn.
She was waiting at my lawn.
I call this spectrographic approach to the eduction of historical audio paleospectrophony, old spectrum sounding. Now, are you all with me that this is a playable sound recording format? Let's have another example, just to be sure. Here are some images from a spectrographic study of the calls of bald eagles recorded in Northern California during 1979 and 1980. The goal was to see whether spectrograms like these could be used to track individual eagles for wildlife management purposes as an alternative to the more intrusive practice of capturing and marking them. But when we play back the spectrograms, we hear something that sounds like the calls of bald eagles. Automatically produced sound spectrograms date back only to the 1940s. That's when the technology was invented for making them. But we can use the same technique to play any inscription that can be interpreted as a graph of sound frequencies as a function of time. Take this graph of time against frequency from 1934, which John C. Steinberg drew by hand based on his painstaking measurement of a sound wave. Can you understand the words? Anyone? Shout it out. Nobody? Going? Joe took father's shoe bench out. It was a standard telephone testing phrase. Now you'll hear it. Well, Steinberg himself never got to find out how well he'd done, but now we know. And there are far older inscriptions out there which we can interpret and deduce as graphs of time against frequency. Now, this is where we might start to go down the rabbit hole in terms of time depth. Here's a plate Athanasius Kircher included in his 1650 book, Musurgia Universalis, showing how to pin an automatic barrel organ. So this is a plate that's designed to show how to place pins into a barrel that would automatically actuate the keys of an organ. So this was how you produced automatic music back then. But I adduced that using the same technique that gave us She Was Waiting at My Lawn just a moment ago. It just so happens that this 365-6-year-old engraving conforms to the format expectations of a modern sound spectrogram as a graph of time against frequency. And the music we hear when we treat it that way is approximately the music Kircher originally meant to encode, even if our method is radically different from anything he could ever have imagined. Even some forms of medieval musical notation can be adduced paleospectrophonically to give us a semblance of their original intended content. Here's a specimen of Dacian musical notation from a manuscript of the mid-10th century. The fact that we can do this illustrates a long-term continuity in our most basic cultural conventions for depicting sound, the spatial positioning of notes along an axis running from left to right as a metaphor for the passage of time, up and down as metaphors for higher and lower frequencies. Now, I could argue that such conventions and continuities exist, but by demonstrating them in practice this way, I think I can make a somewhat more compelling and vivid case. But I want to stress 2 points. First, these images were all originally created as representations of phenomena in the auditory world, not the visual world. When we adduce them, we're not linking visual parameters to auditory ones arbitrarily at our own whim. Instead, these correlations are already present, inherent in the logic of the inscriptions themselves. Second, I'll admit that they're not all records of authentic past sound vibrations passing through the air. This one certainly is not. But neither is a lot of electronica. So I'm not sure that should disqualify them from being considered sound recordings or phonograms or whatever we want to call the stuff of WAV files and MP3s. Now, even if an inscription doesn't tell us anything about pitch, we can still sometimes deduce it meaningfully as a rhythm. Here, for instance, is the original indented paper strip documenting Samuel Morse's famous transmission of the words, "What hath God wrought?" to Baltimore from the Capitol building in Washington. the first message that had ever been sent on a completed working telegraph line in the United States. Watershed moment in modern telecommunications. But I believe it's also significant for another reason. To the best of my knowledge, it was the first event of such historical magnitude to be recorded automatically in a form we can reproduce today, actualizing the dots and dashes over time. The speed should have been about 30 letters a minute, judging from contemporaneous sources. But what should we use to represent these dots and dashes if we want to play it back? Well, people tend to associate Morse code with the sound of an oscillator. Beep, 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 beep. So here's Morse's famous Washington to Baltimore transmission of What Hath God Wrought, as it would have sounded if it had been picked up by a 1,000 hertz oscillator. Anyone know Morse code? That's okay. Back in 1844, hardly anyone would have either. Well, it goes on from there. Much of the material I've laid out so far, you'll find covered in my book, Pictures of Sound, 1,000 Years of Educed Audio with an accompanying CD. But lately, I want to say I've started extending my net to try to do something for the eye akin to what these other experiments have been doing for the ear. And I'd like to revisit that term educe, meaning to bring out, elicit, develop from a condition of latent, rudimentary, merely potential existence. I first started using this language to refer specifically to the process phonographs use to generate sound from records in preference to reproduce. But I've since come to understand it more generally as any process we use to make media content meaningfully perceptible to our senses, not just playing a record, but also projecting a film, or even something as simple as exposing a printed page to light. We don't tend to think of all these practices as equivalent or comparable, but to a point they are. And I think an alternative history of media centered on eduction could be pretty fruitful, extending all the way back to, say, the use of stone lamps filled with animal fat to look at cave paintings. But we can also experiment with eduction ourselves to display historical sources in illuminating ways, regardless of whether this matches their creators' original intentions or not. After all, there's nothing wrong with, quote, using documents contrary to the way they were designed and intended to draw out materials, insights, and understandings that the recorders never intended to preserve, wording that its author, Karol Miskovsky, meant to describe the subversive analytical practice of reading against the grain, but that strikes me as equally applicable to educing against the grain. Creative methods of eduction, even subversive methods of eduction, have long been possible, but digital technologies have made them easier, more attractive to pursue than ever before. So, what happens now if we shift our focus for a moment from historical documents that can be played back as sound recordings to historical documents that can be displayed as motion pictures? Let's give it a try. The Phenakistoscope was the first known animation device to rely on rapidly displayed image sequences introduced during the first half of the 19th century. Back in the day, a Phenakistoscope disc with narrow, evenly spaced slits could be held facing a mirror and spun while the viewer looked through the slits at the disc's reflection, as seen here in the top image. The slits would expose the reflection for a split second each time the disc rotated a step forward in the image sequence, making the images appear to swap out for one another and producing an illusion of movement. Below you see an example from Edward Muybridge's descriptive zoopraxography, published in 1893, entitled Athlete Horseback Somersault. There are 14 images spaced around the circle, so for each successive frame on my animation, I just rotated the image counterclockwise by 1/14 of 360 degrees. But in this case, the images were intended for animation, so the illusion I'm contriving from them here remains consistent with their originally intended purpose. But the exact same technique also lets us animate much older inscriptions that represent changes in visual appearance over time, with images spaced evenly around the circumferences of circles. Here, you see a chart of the phases of the moon from the Ottoman manuscript Zubdat al-Tawarikh, Cream of Histories by Sayyid Lokman al-Shuri, dating from 1583. By treating it as though it were a 19th century Phenakistoscope disc, we can see the moon passing through its phases as a time-lapse animated cartoon. As it happens, charts like this one aren't even hard to find. Here's another from the Catalan Atlas of 1375. And there's two more from the 15th century and the 13th century, respectively. By displaying these moon phase charts this way, let me be clear, I'm not realizing their true purpose for the first time or anything like that. These charts were definitely intended for viewing as still images, and they serve a perfectly good purpose that way. But if we display them as animations today, we can experience them differently, and that gives us an opportunity to understand them differently too. Granted, I'm not sure we gain a lot of insight from these two examples, apart from demonstrating that there was enough continuity in Western European conventions for depicting motion over time for medieval moon phase charts to satisfy the technical requirements of a 19th century animation technique. But let's consider these two copies of a chart of the Cursus Solis et Lunae per signa singula, course of the sun and moon through single signs from manuscripts of the early 9th century. We could study these charts for hours and hours in static form, comparing the images in an effort to figure out the changes over time they're trying to depict. Or we can animate them to gain a comparable impression immediately and a lot more vividly. Granted, it might take some knowledge of medieval astronomical theory to understand just what we're seeing here, and I suspect these are both imperfect copies of a more carefully drawn original anyway. However, the point I want to make is that creative modes of eduction like this have the potential to help us access, understand, and experience the content of these historical inscriptions in ways that are meaningful and analytically useful. Another example of a document that poses some challenges when it comes to eduction, a 3D stereo view, more specifically a stereo view of an alligator, published around 1870. You can compare the two images side by side for as long as you like, but their real value lies in their ability taken together to produce an illusion of three-dimensionality. Stereo views were originally intended to be viewed with a stereoscope that presented one image to the left eye and one image to the right eye, but this isn't particularly useful when it comes to, say, displaying stereo views on the internet. You usually can't assume someone has one of these things. One strategy people sometimes use to display stereo views online is to convert them into anaglyphs like this, but viewing these in 3D requires red cyan glasses. Does anyone in the room have a pair of red cyan glasses handy?
No, not handy, no.
Oh. Here, does someone give it a try? Volunteers, who's got binocular vision? Okay. So how's it look? "3D alligator"? Well, still not something we can count on people having at home if they want to look at these things over the internet reliably. Another popular approach to displaying stereo views online is the so-called, so there's what you need. The so-called wiggle GIF, an animated GIF that alternates rapidly between the right and left images. This yields a sense of three-dimensionality by simulating basically what you experience by jerking your head back and forth really quickly. It's attractive because it doesn't require anything from online viewers, to no special equipment. In essence, we're turning the stereo view into an ordinary, everyday motion picture, which pretty much everyone can display. However, the effect's also a little bit dizzying. I don't know about you, but this kind of gives me a headache. Here's an alternative I came up with. Instead of simply alternating rapidly between the two images, I fade more gradually between them, which lets us cut down on the wiggle rate, making the viewing experience a little more comfortable. Or instead of just fading between the images, we can use readily available image morphing software to morph seamlessly between the images. This technique is more subjective and time-consuming than the others. I had to define about 100 individual reference points, but the illusion's even more convincing. Point I want to make, there's no single right way to educe a source like this one, any more than there's any single right way to interpret it. At the same time, some approaches may be more historically accurate, more accessible, more informative, more compelling, more convenient, or more suitable for particular situations than others. As you can imagine, I'm always on the lookout for new tools I can apply to historical materials in this spirit. So about a year and a half ago, I ran into this report about a project where someone had averaged large numbers of facial photographs to create composite images of the typical face for a variety of different countries. On seeing this, I immediately thought to myself, why couldn't we create averages based not on different countries, but on different moments in time? And then why couldn't we arrange them into timelines so that we could compare them side by side, or better yet, watch historical trends unfolding before our eyes as video animations? It didn't take me very long to find a piece of commercial software capable of averaging large numbers of faces. This is Abrasoft Face Mixer Deluxe. And it didn't take me long. Sorry? Someone will have to tell me. And it didn't take me long to think of a historical question to pose either. 100 years ago, people posing for photographic portraits didn't ordinarily smile. Now they do. Was it possible to use face averaging to trace this gradual change in expression over a long period of time? Well, I decided to try using yearbook photographs, organized by year. Here you see all the pictures of senior women I found in 2 different yearbooks from 1904, together with their average. Notice the lack of smile. And then I created averages for other years at 5-year intervals. Curiously enough, the smile seemed to kick right in at the onset of the Great Depression, a time when people arguably had the least reason to be happy. Maybe they were putting on a bold front, I'm not sure. But in addition to analyzing these averages as still images, we can also display them as a time-lapse movie, like this, and see the transition unfold in motion. I thought I could improve on this result by creating averages for every year rather than at 5-year intervals, but this proved to be pretty time-consuming, and I didn't get very far. But last December, a research team at the University of California, Berkeley, and Brown University published a study called A Century of Portraits, a visual historical record of American high school yearbooks. They'd come up independently with the idea of averaging senior yearbook photos by year and even using the same data to trace the rise of the say cheese smile. I guess these were ideas whose time had come. But more importantly for my purposes, they'd assembled and analyzed a much larger source base than I had, totaling 37,921 images. The original researchers don't seem to have pursued the idea of animating their averaged images themselves, but Ayman Ismail of Slate took a version of their data set, averaged by year rather than decade, and produced a time-lapse video from it. Now, it differs from the animations I've been trying to make because he switched the images out very slowly, about half a second each, so you can get a good fix on each one. But let's see what happens if we try to create a more seamless illusion from them. First, here's an animation that displays each year's individual average for 0.07 seconds rather than half a second and in the original video. The result works after a fashion, but it comes off as rather flickery, jittery, and twitchy. Now, the next animation again advances at a rate of 1 year per frame, but this time each frame is based on the combined data for 2 adjacent years. The accuracy of each frame is higher than before, since it's averaged from roughly double the number of source images, but the time base is less precise, since each frame now corresponds to a 2-year range. Here's a similar animation based on overlapping 4-year composites. As we continue to increase the time span covered by each frame, accuracy and smoothness improve at the expense of time precision. Finally, here's one based on 8-year averages. They're the most accurate yet, with each one averaged from roughly 8 times the amount of data in the first example, but the time base is also the least precise. I also should mention that I cheated a little bit. Every other frame is interpolated in that case. Now, I have a nice technique for creating time-lapse videos from long-term historical processes, but of course this particular material is a lot more recent than most of what I've been sharing with you so far today, but the same technique can, of course, be applied to much older images. For example, to Fayum mummy portraits, a genre of paintings created in Roman Egypt during roughly the first 3 centuries AD. Here are averages based on 181 examples, 97 female portraits, 84 male portraits. The averages on top cover the whole time span of Fayum mummy portraiture, so they give us a glimpse at the genre as a whole with no indication of how it may have changed over time, but we can also create averages for more limited periods, such as the ones shown at the bottom, and then, of course, we can arrange the averages sequentially in a timeline to create a time-lapse animation of the historical development of the genre, like this. Other historical subjects will easily suggest themselves for this approach. Now, if you'd like to see some more experiments and thoughts along these lines, I'd encourage you to check out my blog at griffinage.com, WordPress.com, or if that's too much to remember, griffinage.com will steer you in the right direction. But I'd like to close by pointing out the common thread that runs through all the examples I've shown you this evening. What ties them all together is the strategy of taking modern methods of eduction, such as playing sounds through loudspeakers, displaying rapid image sequences on a screen, and then looking back through the historical record to find older source materials that are consistent with those methods, even if they weren't intended for them. And I found this to be a really productive basis for brainstorming, and hope it might be for some of you as well. Thank you very much.
That was fascinating. Thank you. Do we have time for a couple questions? Anyone? Louis? Wait, we have a mic. Wait, Shauna.
Thank you. Is there any reason to believe that none of the discs that Charles Cros in France recorded in his days have survived, or is this a completely dead end?
Anything that existed that's referred to and known about could conceivably survive. I've turned up many things that were thought to be lost, but I don't know the specifics of that particular case. I'd be happy to talk about it and see what leads we might try to follow up.
He produced a number of discs that were the same idea as Martinville, in which he recorded sound to just study what it looks like. And according to his notes, he did that on glass that was blackened with soot, with smoke, and it is not known if any have survived. And he did that around 1877.
Oh, sorry, it was Charles Cros, right?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misheard the name. Yes, Charles Cros had the idea of recording sound and playing it back before Thomas Edison. He wrote it down, he deposited a sealed packet with the French Academy of Sciences that was later opened. There is no claim that I'm aware of that he actually had done that at that time. In fact, it appears that he was trying to find funding, trying to find collaborators to help make it a reality. The method that he was using was a lot more difficult than what Edison came up with, so it would have taken a lot more to get it to work. In fact, basically it's the technique that Emil Berliner later came up with. But my sense is that he had the idea before Edison at a very early date, but never brought it into actual practice, at least not until the tinfoil phonograph was already a reality.
You didn't describe what the picture of the child rocking back and forth.
No, I threw up a few tidbits here that I didn't really have time to squeeze in. So this is animation produced from a pair of tintype images taken from two lenses, one mounted above the other. Back in the late 19th century, early 20th century, tintype photography was pretty popular, but one of the problems with it was you could only create a single image at a time. Every tintype was unique, so if you wanted multiple tintypes, one way that you did it was set up a camera with 2 or 4 or 8 lenses in it, and take a bunch of photos all at once, looking a little bit like a photo booth image, except that each one is from a slightly different perspective. So I've been collecting examples of duplicate tintypes and creating animations from them, like this one, by morphing back and forth between the images. It's a little bit like the Matrix frozen time effect, where you have a semicircle of cameras all trained on, say, someone who's jumped up in the air. And so they jump up, and then you seem as though you're moving in space around them while they stand still. Same principle. You have a single moment in time captured from several lenses in different places, and you can create a sense of motion from them. So that's what that one's all about. The image in the middle there, that's actually an animation, a video animation of a phonogram. Instead of playing it back as sound, I tried to create a video from it, basically using the strategy of an oscilloscope. So each frame is 10 cycles of the tuning fork. I'm eventually hoping to come up with some of these. This is a very crude proof of concept, but I think these would be wonderful for accompanying phonautograms if you ever want to show one in a movie or a documentary or something like that.
In the recordings where you're lacking the tuning fork, might it not be possible to take some sort of average pitch and use that as a measure of how fast the drum is turning? I mean, you can hear the thing going up and down, you know, it's sort of an average.
Mm-hmm. Right, I think that the key point here is that the fluctuations in speed are much greater than the changes in pitch in the source signal for the most part. So I think that by analyzing them carefully, we will be able to do that. The difficulty, though, is that there are changes in pitch in the source audio, so it's not exact. I think that the trick will be lining a bunch of them up in parallel so that each rotation of the drum is a single strip of a waveform, and then seeing, well, where do they all move in the same direction? And if one of them is going up or down and all the others are staying the same, that's probably real content. That's probably real sound that was picked up in the setting where the recording was made. If they're all going up and down with a similar pattern, that's probably a cranking distortion. So if we can pinpoint those, I'm optimistic that we can even them out. And maybe not get back to the exact original, not speed of recording, but back to a perfectly even speed based on when the thing was recorded, but at least get closer, perhaps close enough to recognize what we're hearing, and then subjectively maybe take it the rest of the way.